Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville, and a longtime progressive activist. So it thrills me to welcome Reverend Barry Lynn as my very special guest on this week's episode of Kibbitzing with Kagan. Barry, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. So I have a million questions, and you've had an extraordinary career. So we're going to have to try to capture some of the highlights. I want to let my viewers know a little bit about your background. So you were born in Harrisburg, but raised in Bethlehem. You got your undergraduate degree at Dickinson, a law degree, a theology degree, and are allowed to practice law, and you have passed the bar in both DC and the Supreme Court. Any other really critical bio background before we get started on your...
No, I don't think so. I've been married for 53 years to the same woman.
We are going to talk about that.
Okay.
So Joanne is a doctor, and I love the story that I read in one of your 3 books here that have been recently released about how you and Joanne met. So we have to start by telling that story.
Okay. I went to Dickinson College. It's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is a somewhat provincial town. And I thought I should transfer out. And I got accepted as a transfer student at Columbia, which of course is in New York City. And I thought that would be a livelier place. But I changed. I said, I'm going to stick it out. I'm so glad I did, because on the very first day that then Joanne Harley, came as a freshman to college. I was now a sophomore, and I was recruiting people for the debate team, and most of the people were kind of dull, but then this beautiful woman walks by and she's interested in the debate team. I thought, wow, better get to know her better. So about an hour later, she walks by again, and there's a guy looking at something that I had created at the table next to the debate. I created a table for a phony organization called the Young Anarchist League. So Joanne walks by, and this kid says, I've never even heard of this group. And she says,
without missing a beat.
This is no missing a beat. This is the most important campus activity. And I put some phony signatures and a little sign that said, because we are anarchists, we don't believe in hierarchy politically, so there's no one here to talk to you. But if you sign up, we'll get in touch with you.
Right.
And I went back I was living in a fraternity house at the time. I went back to guys.
But Joanne said something like, all the cool kids are
she even tried to convince him unsuccessfully to write down that he wanted to be the president. So I go back to my room. The guy I'm staying with says, how'd it go? And I literally said, I have met the woman I'm planning to marry, which is a really stupid thing to say, but it turned out to be absolutely true.
Love it.
We were there all this time.
Amazing. And she's wonderful, and you guys are a beautiful couple.
Thank you.
So let's talk about your career. You started at the United Church of Christ. You started on advocacy. You started with Amnesty on the Vietnam War. There are a lot of people who are watching this who were not born when the Vietnam War was being waged. So what was your biggest takeaway from your earliest advocacy experience? You lobbied in Congress.
I did. And I think one of the things I learned right away, a couple of lessons. Number one, you cannot do anything by yourself. You have got to find people. And if you find people, maybe you can start a movement. And that's absolutely what was necessary to achieve an amnesty, a pardon that eventually came from President Carter. Mm-hmm. But, and the other thing is, you can't take life too seriously, but you can never forget that there are people behind the issues. Those are the people that make a difference. And maybe the best illustration of that is when Jimmy Carter did a pardon for people. If they asked for it, they would get it. I got a call, that was on a Friday, I got a call the next day from a woman that worked in the amnesty movement who said, I got a call from young man. He's trying to come back to his grandmother's funeral, but
Mm.
he was
Come
stopped at
back
the
from
border.
Canada or from
Canada. He was in
somewhere, but.
Canada. He was in
Mhm,
Canada, coming back,
mhm.
and he was stopped. And he said, "But I've been pardoned." And the person at the border said, "Yes, but not you were not pardoned for flight to avoid prosecution. That's a separate federal offense." And so someone said, "Well, what can you do?" And I said, I don't know. I mean, Carter had just gotten in, but again, kind of foolish perhaps, but I called the counsel's office at the White House, a man named Bob Lipschutz, and I said, "Look, Bob," it went on, it rang and rang and rang, and finally, a guy with a Southern accent answers, and it's Bob Lipschutz. I explained this problem. I said, "I'm a big supporter of President Carter's. You don't know me, but here's a problem." And it could be very embarrassing for the president.
Mhm.
I told him the story. He said, "I'll fix it." The next day, Bob was on Meet the Press and somebody said, "Have there been any issues with the Carter pardon?" And he said, "We did have an issue, but I've already resolved it."
Amazing.
Bob Lipschutz, then much later in my career, turned out to board member of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. That's, yeah,
You broke up for a little. He did what with the Americans United?
yeah. He was on our board of
Board.
directors when I
Awesome.
first got there,
Awesome.
and
Well,
he
let's
was
not
running.
get to that
No,
yet. Let's not get
okay,
to that.
no.
All right. General thoughts on Congress today. So you had the experience of working in Congress in the 70s and during the war. How is it different now than it was then?
To be honest, I think that there are very few heroes in Congress. When I was working, I mean, there were giants like Senator Phil Hart of Michigan. He and his wife Jane were strong opponents of the war in Vietnam. People like Lowell Weicker, who
Mhm.
was a
Connecticut,
Republican at the time, and Mark Hatfield and Bob
Oregon,
Packwood. And these are people
Oregon,
from Oregon,
moderate Republicans.
moderate Republicans, and in some cases they were willing to take on the issues that nobody else would take on,
Mhm.
and they would work them so doggedly.
Mhm.
And Lowell Weicker in particular understood the filibuster,
Yes.
which of course now is a horrible thing. But
Yes.
at the time, I remember one night they were debating the tax bill, and Weicker calls me and says, "Hey, Barry, I don't think you're watching C-SPAN, but you ought to. I want to read you something. This is on page 312 of the tax bill." And he read me two sentences. And he said, "Is there a problem with this?" I said, "Yeah, oh, that's a big problem." Hams the phone down, gets back on C-SPAN. I turn on TV. There he is speaking to the president of the Senate. And he says, "I have consulted with counsel, and I believe if you do not take these three sentences out, we'll
Wow.
have to be here all the way through Christmas."
Wow. Wow. Amazing.
And he meant it, and he did it, and he did it for the right reasons, not the wrong ones.
Wow. There's no such thing as a moderate Republican now. The closest
No,
to a moderate Republican is someone who's like here rather than off the chart here.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
great.
mean, the partisanship is really disturbing. I mean, it is very difficult to find. It's people may have difficulty believing this, but South Dakota was once represented by not only George McGovern, but a guy named Jim Aberest, who
Avarice.
was he was pro-Palestinian. He was
Mhm.
probably the most left-wing member
Mhm.
of the Senate. And now, of course, you're lucky to be able to remember the names of the senators from either Dakotas.
I loved that Tom Daschle, former senator, former majority leader, Tom Daschle used to work for Jim Aberesk. I never knew that.
Yes, he did.
So your
Yes,
book.
he did. He was
Cool.
one of the very first people I met,
That's
kind of
cool.
roaming the halls of
Yeah.
Congress this
Good
time.
guy. Really good
Yeah.
guy. Vietnam was clearly the issue that framed your career and your early advocacy. Is there something analogous, something similar that you would say is that of that magnitude now facing our policymakers?
I think the biggest thing facing policymakers at every level is what in the hell is wrong with the United States Supreme Court. What everything that you can do or that people try to do. I mean, you must get twice as many. I must get 15 emails every day talking about guns.
Mhm,
We need to do something about guns.
mhm.
That would be great, except anything you can think of to do about guns is likely to be declared by this 5-member majority
Right.
of ultra conservatives. Um, they're going to declare it unconstitutional. What they've said so far is that the state of New York, it it would be unconstitutional for them to actually require that before getting a permit for concealed carry, that you have a reason to want it. Just asking that question was poison,
Yeah.
according to 5 members of the court.
So that was called the Bruin decision. And when
Yep.
it came down, it caused Maryland to need to modify our legislation to make
Yep.
sure that our gun laws were in compliance with the Supreme Court. Let's pivot over to the ACLU,
Sure.
the American Civil Liberties Union. I think most folks watching it would know
Sure.
that. That stands for the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, our Bill of Rights. So I'm going to start with, are you 100% in agreement with everything the ACLU has ever stood for? And if not, what's something that you've ever disagreed with them?
Yeah. Uh, I'm not in agreement with everything, but unlike Michael Dukakis when he was running for the presidency, he issued a statement, I think it was 4 pages long, about all the things he disagreed with. I worked for a long time on the issue of pornography, and I thought that at the time, the ACLU had a most mind-numbingly stupid
Mhm.
view about child pornography, as if it was just, I understand why they did it, but I was the only person who'd ever go on television and have to explain it. And
Mm.
there were people like Henry Hyde. Once I remember he devoted a
Right,
whole
Congressman from
segment,
Illinois,
congressman from the anti-choice,
anti all
anti-abortion,
things. Yes.
anti and a kind of obnoxious person. And on top of that, but yeah, I thought that was silly. I think there should have been,
What was their position that you were defending, and has that
well,
changed?
their position at the time was you can make it, you can distribute it, and
Child
that's,
pornography.
yeah, I mean, that's just, ridiculous.
Yeah.
I had urged that they create a construct called sexual privacy, that
Mhm.
if you can demonstrate, and I think when you're of a certain age, by default, it demonstrates you couldn't make a conscious decision. I mean, the stuff that's out there is so repugnant, I don't even want to describe it.
Okay.
But if a woman is forced into making pornography. There's a very famous case, a woman named Linda Marciano, who was in Deep Throat, and
Hmm.
she later testified to Congress and to a couple of courts that she had been coerced by her then boyfriend into making that film. If
Wow.
there should be a way for her to make that case and to consider it an invasion of privacy. It's not so unusual because the state of New York has privacy statutes. I wish there were more states that had them. If someone takes your image and puts it next to a product you don't like, if you're a vegan and they have you next to a picture of a turkey sandwich, you can actually file a suit and say that they've appropriated my image
Mm-hmm.
and give the impression that I like turkey sandwiches,
Okay.
but in fact I don't.
Okay.
ACLU has changed the policy a little bit, but not enough.
So before we continue on, you have just released 3 books, and it's
Mm.
one of the tiny little silver linings of COVID, which is people had time to take on a big project. And so they are called Peace, Porn, and Prayer. And we're going to be touching on, and already have touched on, some of them.
Sure.
But I just want to make sure. And at the end credits, we're going to include the link so that people
Terrific.
can purchase this. So you shifted to run Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and you were there as director from 1992 to 2017. What was your hardest battle there, other
I
than
think that,
everything?
yeah, it started with at the ACLU, I was doing some work on the separation of church and state. There was a one golden moment during that period when we could have done something about childcare,
Mhm.
preschools, by opening up public schools to this kind of treatment for uh, teaching um, little kids. And this is a sad example of what happens when progressives fight among themselves. The reason it didn't pass, it had huge support. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House, the chairman of the Education Committee in the House. But Marion Wright Edelman opposed the
Children's
idea.
former head of the Children's Defense
Yeah, and
Fund.
she, a fabulous civil rights
Yeah,
icon, but
yeah.
she thought that churches should be encouraged to provide this service.
Mhm.
And it was just it was a huge mistake,
Mm.
because I have never known a church-based daycare center that didn't have as one of its principal objectives coming transferring their religious beliefs to their students in the hopes that they will then go to their parents and the
Yeah,
parents will start to come to the church.
yeah.
It's a part of the nature of what it is to be an evangelical organization.
So list 3 or 4 briefly examples of the most egregious violations of separation of church and state that you worked on.
Yeah, one was trying to make sure that creationism was not returned to public schools.
Okay.
The two Supreme Court cases had
And
said,
I'm
both
sure that
from,
everyone watching
yeah,
understands that that's
yeah,
God creating humans as
God
opposed to
creating.
evolution.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's not science. It's an interesting theory. And maybe you want to talk about it in a philosophy class, but it has no business in a science class. And first case involved human evolution. Oh, you can't teach it at all. The second case, also from Louisiana, was balanced treatment. You'd give equal time
Mm,
to creationism and
evolution.
evolution. And then the most important case during my tenure at Americans United happened in Pennsylvania, where a school district in Dover, Pennsylvania, in the middle of the state, decided that they were going to encourage students to go to the school library to look at books promoting the idea of intelligent design, a kind of a creationism in a lab coat. It's
Mm,
not science. And the judge that was uh, presided over this case was a man named John Jones. John Jones had been he had been promoted to this job position by Senator Rick Santorum, one of the
mm.
truly most obnoxious
Former
people I've
former
perhaps
U.S.
ever,
senator from
senator from
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, and a very strange fellow in his own right. However, um, so in order to do that, in order to get it, I thought, gee, this is the luck of the draw, but this is a guy that Rick Santorum likes. Rick
Mm,
Santorum is a huge advocate of
yeah,
intelligent design.
yeah.
And I thought this could be a disaster, but it
So
wasn't.
when I was in the House, then Governor Paris Glendening proposed $2 million one time, I promise.
No,
It's just for $2 million of public taxpayer money for private and parochial school textbooks. So it's
yeah.
just textbooks and it's just one time. Uh, it still exists now, all these years later, because he did do it again and again and again. And then Governor Hogan increased it. Governor Moore has tried to
Sure.
start phasing it out, but give your thoughts as to why that's not okay if you're looking to separate church and
Yeah.
state.
I mean, most of the beneficiaries of school vouchers or this kind of will just pay for a few things. Um, Almost all of the beneficiaries are religious schools.
Right.
It's a direct subsidy. If you give a voucher to a parent, the parent then goes to the school and says, here, I got my voucher. It's just the same as if the states wrote a check for it.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, when I look back on my career, the draft, it ain't coming back because there was so much hostility to merely registering people for the draft. And there were only 19 people who, when Carter kind of changed his mind and decided amnesty is one thing, but I'm going to start up selective service again. Only 19 people were ever prosecuted, and 18 of them were people who wrote to the Justice Department and said, here's my name, here's my address, come and get me.
Wow.
So there was smoke and mirrors, and
Yeah.
Ed Meese was involved in
Former Attorney
planning and
General.
plotting.
So, okay, so
So
let's go
that
back
we're
to
done with that.
textbooks.
Yeah.
What's the
Yeah.
best reason why public money for private school textbooks shouldn't be continued in Maryland or anywhere?
It shouldn't be continued because there's always the chance that any kind of textbook selection is going to be based on religious principles, not on sound educational ones. And this is why it's wrong. You can divert things. There's been an erosion by the Supreme Court. It used to be, of course, you can't give money to religious schools.
Right.
And then they said, well, you can give textbooks if they're the same ones being used in the public schools, and an erosion
Right.
to the point where, frankly, you can now virtually subsidize an entire religious school system, according to the Supreme Court.
I have so many questions, and we're running long already. Faith leaders. There are those of us who don't like the pontificating and politics from the pulpit, but they do happen on the left and the right, and endorsing this is our candidate, or go out and vote against or for these candidates. Is there a line in your view as to what a faith leader should and shouldn't be able to do with his or her congregation?
Yes, I was speaking to a group of rabbis who asked that question early in my tenure at Americans United. They said, well, how are we supposed to know? And I said, just ask yourself this question. If you make a statement from the starting at the synagogue or the pulpit in the church, ask yourself this question. Am I doing this to benefit someone's electoral career? And if the answer is yes, then don't do it. You can speak to on the pulpit, and any religious leader, imams and pastors, preachers, rabbis, they can talk about the moral issues as they should. And you can even argue that perhaps more members of the clergy ought to be speaking out against guns. More of them should be speaking out to make sure that the right of reproductive choice and justice is preserved. But you don't then say, oh, and by the way, I also have a list of people who are in agreement with me, and you ought to know them.
So what about the exploitative references to faith by political leaders? So whether it's sending thoughts and prayers after a mass shooting, whether it's Donald Trump with his upside down Bible, where is it okay and where isn't it in your view?
I think the best thing that politicians can do when it comes to religion is not mention it at all. And now, when Joseph Lieberman, who is a Democrat from Connecticut, when he was running with Al Gore on that ticket, I remember being on CNN, and they wanted me to comment on whatever he was going to say. And he had tons of Bible allusions and all kinds of theological positions that he wanted to articulate.
And just to say, okay, so Joe Lieberman, former senator, U.S. senator from Connecticut, also an Orthodox Jew.
Correct.
Very devout and involved in the community. So I just want to give that context.
Yeah, absolutely. And he, the host of the show on CNN said, well, what do you think of this? And I said, well, I think if he says this tomorrow and the next day, then he's crossed the line. It's one thing to say, this is what I believe. It's important. It was certainly important to Joe Lieberman, his whole faith tradition. But you don't run on that. And you don't, as he later did, say that he thought that people who were religious were likely to be more moral than people who were not. That was a huge mistake.
So it's interesting. So I was a founding board member of a group called the Faith and Politics Institute, founded by my wonderful friend and just hero, Reverend Doug Tanner, Methodist minister. And it was about elected officials keeping their moral and spiritual values and using those to guide their political and policy work. And that seemed like the right balance. It wasn't shoving my views down your throat, but it was definitely sort of my being guided by and lifted up by, and not polls and leadership, but values.
Yeah, I think that the most important values, though, to be articulated, and I think you can claim that they're in every faith tradition, are the very values in the Constitution itself: equal justice, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. All of these things are good. Alan Dershowitz, before he kind of went over to the strange side, um, I I
Longtime
posed
law professor, civil
law at
libertarian.
Harvard,
Yeah,
yeah,
Harvard.
and but I said to Alan, what do you think would happen if there was an effort to abolish the death penalty, but everybody speaking in the legislature based it on one quotation from the Christian Bible?
Mm-hmm.
And I posed that at an ACLU conference too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my answer would be, if you can't think of any reason
Right.
other than that, probably a court should look at it as they did look at so-called silent prayer case decades
Mhm.
ago,
Right.
and
Right.
say it's a cover up. It's not real.
Right.
Yeah,
So I want to cover a few quick issues.
sure.
Because of your faith background, and yet you have been such a thoughtful, progressive policy leader. How is it that you came to be, and I'm just going to name a few, speak briefly to women's reproductive rights, right to an abortion, marriage equality for our lesbian and gay friends, and death with dignity, right to die legislation? How does that, because that is where those three issues in particular, but there are obviously many others,
Sure.
divide faith communities, and the faith leaders sometimes don't come out down on the same side that you and I might.
No, they don't. I think that I had this very important event happen in college. One of my roommates was going to London, he said, for spring break. I said, that must be fun. He said, no, it's not going to be fun because my girlfriend is pregnant. I said, wait a minute. This was in 1969.
Yeah,
I said,
pretty
well,
relatively.
why don't you get one in New York or Massachusetts? Those were so tightly controlled by, at that time, Roman Catholic hierarchy, you
Mm,
couldn't obtain a lawful abortion there.
mm,
So he had to go, to literally to another country to do that. And this started me thinking, wait a minute, if that's the kind of power that people have because of their religious or religiosity, um, that shouldn't that should not fly. That
yeah.
should not be permitted. And I think that was the issue more than anything else that got me into the separation of church and state
Mm,
issue. As far as LGBTQ rights, this is a central issue. I think the Americans United for Separation of Church and State at the time that I got there didn't really have a strong position. And over the 25 years that I was there,
mhm.
I moved the organization,
Good for you.
and I got tremendous support from its members to take the right position on those gay
Mhm.
rights issues.
And death
Uh,
with dignity, right to
Death with
die?
dignity, I think there is an argument that in a culture like this, maybe there would be powerful forces in the medical profession because they don't like people to die. That would make it a little too easy, they encourage people to think about, well, your family, you don't want to bankrupt them, and encourage people to make a decision that's not really theirs. So that that's the only downside that I see. But I've spoken to uh, compassion and choices conferences and so on. You can't let theology be the guide to making those decisions as
Right.
personal and as intimate as
Yes.
that.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed. Is there any issue that you've changed your mind on over the years?
Nuclear power. I used to hate it, and now I become convinced that this is something we should look at because things have changed. This is not 3 Mile Island. This is not Chernobyl. And maybe we ought to take another hard look at that.
Really interesting. Thank you. What do you think is the toughest policy issue that's facing us today?
I think it's guns. And I think it's the fact that the Supreme Court has only 9 people. There's nothing sacrosanct about having 9 people. We had 8 for a while around the Civil War. It's not in the Constitution. We should expand the United States Supreme Court, and we should do it unfailingly with an understanding that this whole judicial system has been corrupted by the large number of appointees, including from the Donald Trump administration.
Yes.
So we got to, and then we got to do something about guns. We cannot have 222 mass shootings in this country, and we're only here, in the month of May.
Right. We've talked about the Supreme Court more than once, and you've been admitted to that bar. Have you ever argued a case there?
I have never argued a case before the court.
But you've been in the court during witness.
Many times. And I know Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, a Democrat of Georgia, when they were having an argument one day about whether the draft was constitutional since it only drafted men. I was in the elevator with Senator Nunn. He said, "Barry, if you were wearing a black robe now," he said, "I'd be really nervous." And I said, "You ought to be." But of course they said no. And I think this court would literally rule the same way.
Yeah. Few more questions before we get
Sure.
to the past five.
Okay.
You and I cross paths not only through political stuff, but through music.
Exactly.
So talk about, and as folks may know who are watching, I have my own house concert series since 2003 called Folk and Great Music. And you've hosted concerts over the years and certainly are a great supporter and stuff. The role of music in politics and policy.
I think is incredibly important. When I was in high school, I would listen. I was already against the war in Vietnam, but it was, shall we say, a highly unpopular viewpoint. I could tell that from, I'd make some speech in a class, and then some guy'd come up at lunch and threaten to kill me, not literally, just beat me up.
Yeah.
And then one night I'm listening to the radio, lived in Bethlehem, listening to a show from Philadelphia with this thing called folk music. Yeah. And there's a song, two songs by Phil Oakes, the great Phil Oakes.
Phil Oakes.
One of them, one was "I Ain't Marching Anymore," and the other was "Draft Dodger Rag," which if you look at the lyrics, it's maybe some of them aren't so PC, and I mean that in a good way.
Yes.
But anyway, I thought, man, this guy's like famous. He's making records, and this is exactly the kind of question I have. Yeah. And it really was life-changing.
Yes.
Life-changing. And I've followed it throughout. At Americans United, we did a whole series for 3 years called Voices United for Separation of Church and State.
Yep.
The first year.
So before we move on, we have to just say Phil Oakes, OCHS.
Yes.
Look him up, listen to his music. His sister Sonny, who survived him, his terribly tragic premature death. Sonny has kept his music alive for decades, and others, a lot of singer-songwriters perform his music and travel and continue his message. So his music
certainly do.
Is unbelievable. His voice is beautiful, but his lyrics are really what to pay attention to. Go ahead, Barry.
You got it.
Continue.
Yeah, and
Voices United.
We the late John Jennings, of course, the lead guitarist and good friend of Mary Chapin Carpenter's. We were sitting around having a pre-Thanksgiving dinner. Lunch downtown in DC. I said, "John, I'd like to do something. I'd like to get us to raise money." And many of the choice groups had raised money with concerts. And he said, "We could do that. But," he said, "we could also have a concert in every state on the same weekend."
Yes.
And I said, "Whoa, that's really a great idea." And Katie Curtis, who we both know, decided she would love to do that.
From Massachusetts. Dynamo, yes.
Dynamo and Folk Rock Goddess, I think is what the
there you go.
New York Magazine called her once. But she found 49 states. We couldn't find someone in Alaska. Now I know people in Alaska who are singers, but we were trying to get some native singers, and it just got a little too complicated.
Yeah.
And it culminated in this event in Los Angeles with Katie, Mary Gaucher, Sarah Silverman, and Russell Brand.
Okay. So Katie Curtis is with a C. Katie. And
with a C.
Curtis, if you're looking up, Mary Gaucher is harder to spell. Gauthiter, I think.
That's exactly right.
All right. So let's shift to comedy, which is another tool that you have used. Talk about the importance of comedy in persuading people and educating people.
I think most comedians understand the power that they have. And I was at the 92nd Street YMCA. I had an opportunity some years ago having interviewing Kate Clinton, Liz Winstead, who were one of the founders of The Daily Show, and Louis Black.
Nice.
And
Comedian.
I said, I told a story that the guy who wrote, why can I not remember that? Catch 22, Joseph Heller,
Uh-huh.
was asked at an event, do you think that literature can have this kind of an influence? I mean, did it have any effect on turning people against the war? And he said, my book didn't do that. If we had thought that Uncle Tom's Cabin alone could deal with slavery, little Liza would still be crossing the ice.
Mm.
Now, people who know Joseph Heller said that was probably baloney. He
Uh-huh.
probably believed it. But the truth is it does. It has tremendous power. And there's a lot of blowback when I say this. I don't think conservatives can be comedians because they're always trying to push down. They're always trying to take defenseless people and make them even
Yeah.
less, more defenseless. But I think if you want to criticize the powers that be,
Yep.
that's a good thing. And
So if you
comedy
can,
does it. Comedy makes an incredible
yeah,
a difference. And a lot of these guys have become good friends of mine.
if you can get people to laugh or sing along, I think you help
Yep.
build community.
You got it.
God, what makes you nervous? You've been on TV and radio and testified before Congress, blah, blah, blah. Anything, what makes you nervous?
Shortly after I retired, I had a near-death experience. And I must say that was 3 weeks after Louis Black emceed the thing. Katie was there, Mary Gaucher
Beautiful.
was there,
I was there.
Wade Henderson was there, you were there, Jamie Raskin was there,
Yeah.
and
I
it was
counted.
great. And then 3 weeks later, I ended up in a small hospital in Western Pennsylvania, and I couldn't get out of bed, and took them 3 days to figure out that I needed to be moved to a place for the cardiac unit. They did. And then I was 36 hours under anesthesia. And when I came out, I couldn't speak. That was
Terrifying.
and actually get back to Lewis. I mean, I had posted his goofy little things on Facebook because I had nothing to do. I could barely walk.
Mhm.
He called. He said, hey, would you do a rant at my show in Washington in a couple of weeks? And I said, Lewis, man, I said, I can barely stand up. He said, I don't care if you whisper it, just do it.
Nice.
I did it, and that was kind of a breakthrough moment. And I
There you
think
go.
an opportunity like that really got me started on the road to recovery.
Good.
Yeah.
The last things I want to cover, the
Okay.
press and social media as avenues of making your case. Do you do social media much? I mean, obviously, I know you do Facebook and stuff, but
Yeah.
But in general, as a catalyzing tool, what are the roles and how have you used? Just one story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's overrated, honestly. I think it makes it
Social
too
media or
easy.
the press
Yeah,
in general?
the social media. I
Okay.
mean, I think too many people think, well, look, I'll
Tweet.
sign this petition.
Yeah.
I'll do a tweet. I'll retweet somebody
Right.
else's tweet.
Right.
I've done something.
Right.
It's not useless. I'm not suggesting that, but I think people sometimes think that's all they need to do. Progressives, in my judgment, always go home too early. This started in the 60s. You'd have these meetings and the conservatives would hang around and liberals at about 9 o'clock go, oh, it's getting late. And then they go home. And that's bad. You
All
got to
right.
stick with it. You must stick with it, and you can never, ever give up. If you think the principle is right, you can never stop fighting for it, no matter what forces are out there opposing you.
Amen. And on
Amen.
we are going to go to our fast five.
Okay.
Reverend Barry Lynn, extraordinary civil libertarian, thought leader, music presenter, and all things. 5 quick questions, 5 quick answers.
Sure.
First, what is the favorite book you've ever read that you didn't write and that's not the Bible?
It's a book called Why Does the World Exist? And it poses the question, the ultimate philosophical question. There's no, why are we here? Do we exist at all? It's still in print, and I strongly suggest people take a look at it.
Do you remember the author's name by any chance?
No, because
Okay.
I can't.
That's okay. Question
Okay.
2.
Yeah.
What's an inspirational quote that guides you that you share regularly?
There's a line from a song by John Denver. Today is the first day of the rest of your life. And if you can do that, if you can think that way, it's a huge positive influence on the lives of everybody around you.
Nice. I was at the penultimate concert of his life at a fundraiser for cystic fibrosis that a friend of mine put on in Baltimore. What a loss. What a loss. Question 3. Who would you say is your biggest mentor, shiro, or hero?
I think it is Morton Halperin. Mort Halperin was the head of the ACLU office in Washington for a long time. He had worked for Henry Kissinger. Kissinger tapped his phones. When I come back to Washington, I usually see Mort.
Nice.
And he said he was going to hire people who knew what they were doing. And then he also said, there's nothing you can't get done in Washington if you don't have to take credit for it. And he was right.
There you go. Question 4, because of our music, our love of music, I have to have a music question. What is an anthem? What is a song that lifts you up and inspires you?
The most powerful song is a song about Juan Romero. He was the kitchen worker who held up Bobby Kennedy's head at the time of his assassination. It's written by my good friend Tom Pacheco. And if you go on YouTube and look at any version of that, you will say that is powerful. And I think you'll also say, this makes me cry. And the second, Grand Central Station, the post 9/11 song by Mary Chapin Carpenter. Powerful song.
Okay. The 5th question.
Yes.
Rev Barry Lynn, the question that I ask everybody: what is your hidden secret superpower? What is a skill or talent you have, something you're really good at that most folks can't do?
I guess it's finding something to say that is funny. I don't tell jokes, but I do see the world in a certain odd way. And I always try to make sure that no matter what the audience is, I am going to start and continue with little stories about my sometimes quirky view of life in this world.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Barry, I am so honored to call you a friend, an ally, a colleague, and thank you for an extraordinary career.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate your taking time to kibitz today. I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Terrific. You too.
And in the meantime, before we go, I'm going to hold these up one more time. Get these: peace, horn, prayer. They're fascinating reading. Barry, I have to do a quick PS, because while I talked about the names of your 3 books, I didn't talk about what the universal umbrella theme is, which is paid to piss people off. Talk about the origin of that phrase.
Yeah, a young man came up to me at a party and he said, Mr. Lynn, when I get out of school, he was in high school, when I get out of school, I want to do what you do. And I said, Connor, what do you think I do? He said, I think you get paid to piss people off. And I said, it's a little more than that. But if you're not pissing somebody off, you're probably not doing your job.
And not making a difference. And you're not allowed to tweet the name of
No.
book?
Yeah, I attempted to purchase an ad on Twitter, and I was rejected because of inappropriate material. And I can't think, I mean, one pictures of my then 3-year-old daughter, and one was a picture of Ed Meese, and the other's me. And I didn't think any of those. But the 1972 great comedian George Carlin was
Right.
arrested for saying 7 words, one of which was piss.
Which is absurd. Piss, piss,
Absurd.
piss. Paid
Yeah.
to piss people off. All right. On that note,
Thank you.
we're out of here.
You
See
got it.
you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.